Thank you very much, Alice, for that wonderful introduction and for creating this space for discussion about our work and our community, poetry and life. I'm so happy to be in discussion with Natalie today for this edition of Voicing Our Silences, based around the theme of girlhood as well as mother tongues. And as you mentioned, whilst we speak from the truth of our own experiences about girlhood is a theme that we are looking to discuss today in the most inclusive ways. So to me, girlhood is a word that represents a time that is full of both contradiction and idealism. So beauty on the one hand and violence, innocence, as well as awareness of power structure, voicelessness, and the desire to speak. And I wanted to share this line from In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado before I do my readings that I've been struck by, where the question is asked, why do we teach girls that their perspectives are inherently untrustworthy? And I think writing about girlhood validates that our perspectives are in fact inherently trustworthy and essential. To start, Nat and I are both going to read a poem or two poems that respond to this theme of girlhood. I'm going to begin the readings. The first poem I'm going to read is called Piranha. It is from my recent pamphlet with Bad Betty Press. It's a prose poem about mishearing language and takes the form of a dictionary entry, which will complement the workshop that Nat's going to lead in the first half of this session. And the question that's asked is, in Tamil is, are you jealous? So, Piranha. I began to learn it as a child one summer, and to the gentle ears of my girl self, it sounded like the refrain of an epic song. Ungaka Paramea. Around that time, petty rivalry seemed to feature in the conversation of the adults around me. The Kanjivaram sari of one woman would evoke the envious sentiments of another. A newly purchased home in Surrey unleashed in a man both bitterness and suspicion. My aunts spoke of it in their mother tongue as parama, jealousy, which I misheard as piranha. Perhaps I understood in my little body that jealousy was a predatory disposition. I too would be asked whether I was jealous of a whole manner of incidents, the friendly affection shown to girl cousins by my grandfather, my mother's beauty at a New Year's Eve party, which at 6 years of age I feared I did not possess. Ungaka paramea. One day, rather than a question, I began to understand it as an instruction. And so I collected these bone-toothed creatures, kept them in my pocket, fed them little pieces of chicken flesh, and took them with me to school in my ruby red satchel. And if I was so intimate with them, then surely, I thought, I must in fact be one too. See me stand in front of this mirror. Notice this mouth cling on to breast. Observe the body, a single flash of muscle moving. Little girl, what are you thinking? Mass of teeth, frenzy. The second poem I'm going to read is called Period Party, or Punyadhanam in Tamil, which is essentially a public puberty ceremony for girls when they first get their periods. It's written in a combination of both poetry and prose, so the register does change. And content warning, there is a reference to the word rape in this poem, but it doesn't have any other depictions, but it does mention that word. So, period party, Punyadhanam. A big girl now. Fathers and mothers rush to tell the news to uncles and aunties of her bloodletting. Stories of a daughter's body travel fast, otherwise unaccommodated. I've been wanting to write a poem about the ritual ceremony that girls in my Tamil community are often made to participate in when they get their first period. I'd been unable to write that poem, afraid to confront the shame I still experienced in my own body. I was naively optimistic that such things were no longer being practiced. Earlier this year, however, I received an invitation to attend the puberty ceremony of the child of a family friend. Her skin is soft buttermilk, breasts tender from the effort of first growth. Walking with hunched shoulders, nipples protruding, pink lace lines her first bra. The brown stain on her cream nightie changes everything, nothing. She still watches Neighbours on Saturday mornings, but doesn't want to hold her mama's hand anymore. She tiptoes the aisles of supermarkets to buy sanitary napkins. New emotional consciousness arrests her. The false bravado of 13-year-old girls learning about childbirth and sexual education, the physical response to the sounds of men and rape. If you search period party on Google, you enter the world of professional puberty celebration planning. This is particularly popular in parts of the world where there is a concentration of Tamil people, like South India, Germany, France, and England. There are YouTube videos where girls of 11, 12, 13 years of age are taken through a ceremony which resembles a wedding. Can a girl of 12 consent to the announcement of her period? It is confusing for me that some girls say they look forward to experiencing the ceremony. The ritual has its roots in a time when a girl's first period would mark the sign of the beginning of her sexual life and availability for marriage. If you look closely at the girls' smiling faces in the video, it is like watching a strange mime. The girl bleeds. The girl bleeds over and over. You live to see this girl bleed over and over, yet she lives. Thanks very much for listening to my reading. It is now my greatest pleasure and honor to invite Natalie to read her poems.
Thank you so much for your beautiful, beautiful poems, Niroshini. And as always, it means so much to share this space with you and to share many creative spaces with you. Yeah, it's like Niroshini said, the theme of girlhood is really important to us both. And I feel like writing about it is our way of showing that our voices are trustworthy and they are worth listening to, despite what history and various sections of society might try and tell us. So the poem, I'm just going to introduce the poem I'm going to read for this section. And to preface that, I've always been fascinated by how diacritical marks completely change the sense of a word in Vietnamese. So I wanted to write a poem exploring that using my middle name. And also the poem naturally explores my family history and so addresses scenes of girlhood and womanhood. Middle name with diacritics. Linh Home, Soul. 1. A voice tapping from inside the skin. 2. Quan Am, the goddess of compassion, at the end of her 9th life, having shed the last stinging layer of flesh. 3. A temple full of starving yellow birds. 4. Ancestors who stitch your prayers into houses with the floors missing. 5. The name of 4 teenage girls in my mother's refugee camp. 6. The part of me often left out or misspelled that moves quietly through the world. Ling, soldier. 1. 2 sisters who delivered a village from the throat of a tiger, the Red River's champions, anointed as queens. 2. A woman, their descendant, 200 years later, who carried girls from the betrayal of moonlight, searched a field for the skinless face of someone she loved. 3. Frenchman who guarded Bangwai's school gates when she was a girl. She cycled right up in white aoyai, offered paper flowers. She had never heard a foreign accent before. 4. The ringing in the ears after a grenade shreds open the morning. 5. The rising tone of flesh, heavy with napalm. 6. A man who searches a crater he made earlier, who returns to Wei many years later, touches reconstructions of all he destroyed. Ban Len, bravery. 1. A monk whose heart will not burn, no matter the heat, whose words tugged his spirit from his body to watch over the spectacle of suffering, the way a flower opens to drought. 2. A woman hiding bribes in the walls, stops the shake of her hands when she lies. 3. A girl in her parents' deserted house in Baklio, selling hats, waiting for word from her mother, hiding from an older man who has been watching her grow. 4. A mother bargaining for broken rice, cubes of pork, cigarettes, ginger to help stomach her 12th child, still inside her. 5. A man who lies on a table, on a boat, no anesthetic, black powder medicine, the smell of burning. 6. A girl again in a camp, her fingers on her sister's wrist through the night. Ra Lun, to command. 1. A girl who stops eating, asks her body to follow her into silence. 2. Bullets at a teenage boy's heels as he runs from his uncle's seized field. 3. Scripture by unholy men ordering Ongwai to tame a jungle into a home. 4. Heirloom surrendered for silence, birth dates, sea, exile. 5. Names given up because home did not rest easily on unyielding tongues. 6. My mother's medicated bloodstream that tells her her pain does not exist, that her bones have not yet lived through all they can endure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for that wonderful reading. That opening line is so stunning, a voice tapping from inside the skin, and just the energy builds throughout. A girl who stops eating asks her body to follow her into silence. It's just so gorgeous. Thank you so much. So to start things off, Nat and I thought we would have a discussion about girlhood, as well as both our use of reference to other languages. So Nat, would you like to kick things off and talk about what girlhood means to you, a little bit about writing this poem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like I said, for me, girlhood, and like you said, is about trusting your voice and trusting these stories that people and sections of society have deemed unworthy or something to be ashamed of. But the spur for this poem in terms of language was because even though I can't speak Vietnamese, which is one of my biggest regrets, I've always been really interested in diacritical marks and how they just completely change the sense of words. So I decided to explore this with my middle name because it's the only part of me that acknowledges my, or the only part of my name that acknowledges my Vietnamese heritage. That is often left out, erased, misspelled, mistakenly anglicized. So in this poem, I wanted to recenter it while also centering the country and culture and history that it comes from. But also, like writing about diacritics for me was a political choice because we're in a climate where a lot of people are made to suffer for using their native languages. And I just really wanted to resist these racist and very suspicious attitudes by celebrating the beauty and uniqueness of Vietnamese. So that was like the spur for this particular poem. Yeah. So how about you? How do you what spurred you to write those poems that you read before?
So I think I'm drawn to girlhood, I guess, because of the intensity of that time period. And so many of the experiences and memories are not yet been processed or resolved. So I think that's a real draw for me. And I think like you said, it's that experience of not finding yourself in art or considered worthy of literature, which is what makes you want to put yourself in there almost. And I think girlhood is like as a literary project, I think is quite important in like the writers I really enjoy reading. So I think I'm naturally drawn to that in my own writing. In terms of the specific poems, Period Party was like a sort of a breakthrough poem for me. It was one of the first poems I published. It was an experience which was really intense. I mean, as a 12-year-old girl, watching, like I've seen photos of myself. I'm like a little dumpling, sitting on the floor, going this ceremony. So it makes me really angry, but because the whole like performance of a girl's sexuality for an audience, for a community, really. But I also think like girlhood, which I'm not sure I've explored enough, is also quite funny. Like even in the context of puberty ceremonies, I've heard stories of my younger cousins and nieces pretending to have their periods, like holding their bellies, like pretending to have a fever, so that they will also participate. So there's like this whole shade of experiences in girlhood, sort of shame and joy. So I think it's really, really rich, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
And Purana is more about the mishearing of language. But I think what's really interesting, there is some like truth in that mishearing. I think it was not accidental that I heard Purana as jealousy. So I think that's very interesting. There's like an intelligence in that. Have you found any of these sort of synchronicities in because I know you sort of are very like close to your mom, and you speak a lot with your mom in developing some poems or language. Is there anything interesting that you've found from that experience? Has that enabled you to understand yourself and your past better?
Yeah, I think obviously me and my mum grew up in very, very different environments, but the kind of universal experiences we share are vulnerabilities and being treated on certain aspects of our girlhood. So periods, things to do with body image, being treated as taboo, or being treated as things to not take seriously, or things that you kind of can't have to ignore, that you can't bring up. So yeah, in my writing, I think for me it's important to reclaim these things and give voice to these very seminal times in our lives that we're just not encouraged to talk about. I think that's where our overlaps of voice often come. So yeah, you've already spoken a bit about your bilingualism. Do you think it helps you find a way into your subject matter, find your way into like the subject matter?
Yeah, what you said was really interesting about these silences around like bodily experiences. In terms of like, I always hesitate when I get asked about mother tongue questions, because I think part of me resists it because I feel, I was born Tamil. That was the language I spoke for, the first 6 years of my life. It's my, but I also realize, I've now lived outside of South Asia for so long. So I feel like in terms of approaching writing, that is the sort of oral landscape. So it would be like not true not to have it in the poetry, but at the same time, I'm not a fluent writer. So there is an element of oh, what am I doing? And is this okay? And will how will my family respond to this? And how will family in India and Sri Lanka, how will they respond to it? But I don't fundamentally feel there is a separation in myself. It's only when I feel like I'm in landscapes or where people sort of see a distinction. And I think that's what's really like beautiful about your work and so many others who are engaging with this sort of duality. It's almost that permission to like language should be playful, like there shouldn't be like a seriousness about it, which I think I originally approached it with, but like nobody's gonna like, you're not gonna get in trouble if you put a poem with a bit of like a foreign language in it. So I think it's a place of play, a place of reclamation. Like you said, it's also about like what has poetic resonance. So what about you? Do you have you faced any hesitancy and when you've
definitely. I think because for me, I can't speak Vietnamese. Like it's never been, for me, it's not a mother tongue as so much as like my mother's tongue, if that makes sense. So it's a language I grew up around. So for me, it was a very much an auditory part of my girlhood. And so it would feel like something was really missing if I left it out altogether. But when I'm reinterpreting, say, girlhood stories passed down to me by mum, and thinking about mine as well, I'm very aware that most of my mum's stories took place in Vietnam, and that the story she's referring to did take place in Vietnamese. So to translate all of that completely into English would just feel really wrong, like leaving out a really important part of the story. And it's like, so my relationship with English is kind of fraught because it's a language that I feel able to express myself in, and a language that I learned to love words and reading and writing in. But I'm always aware that it's like that because of an accident of birth, right? It's the fact that I didn't acquire Vietnamese alongside English because of various family circumstances.
History and
exactly. And so my relationship with my mother's mother tongue is that it's something that I love the sound of and I associate with a lot of childhood memories. But it's also something that I regret being able to speak. It's a very it's a very specific experience for me, having those kind of associations when I'm writing. So how do you decide what to translate, do you think, and what not to translate when you're writing?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's very much a sort of artistic decision, like what it's like what brings truth to the poem, what also like there's an element of not wanting to exploit yourself in a way, like, or your conversations with your parents. So being very thoughtful about how to introduce that language. I mean, it's still very like early stage in terms of an experimental stage, really. What has like a visual quality, what adds a visual quality to the poem. So I think those are the things, how I decide which ones to translate. Would you like to do your workshop now? Just having a look.
Sure. Okay, so where are we? I have my little plan up here. Okay, so this is called Bodying Abstract Nouns / Building a Definition poem, and it is inspired partly by my Middle Name with Diacritics poem, partly by Niroshini's Purana poem, and also I think a good poem to read after this workshop would be Lad Lad by Troy Kabida, which also does a similar thing with definition and language. So the first part of this workshop is 2 minutes, and just first of all list 10 abstract nouns. So that's names of things you cannot touch. So abstract nouns are often concepts or emotions. So for example, desire, time, night, childhood, etc. So I'm just going to start the clock, 2 minutes, 10 abstract nouns. Okay, part 2 of the workshop is to choose one of those abstract nouns that you've just listed and write down your associations with it or your memories surrounding it, or both. So I'll give you 3 minutes for that, and also type that in the chat. Okay, and the next part of this is that now think about the noun, how the noun would behave if it was a solid object or a living being. So you might think about how that noun would move, what it would be made of, what color it would be, what sound it might make, what it might smell like, and what it might resemble. I'll give you 3 minutes for that, and also just type all that in the chat. Okay, so the last part of this workshop is to use the two lists you've just made as your word palette to create a definition poem. So your title could include the noun that you're thinking of to guide the reader. Or if it helps as a frame for the poem, you could use anaphora, where the noun appears at the start of every line. So for example, bravery smells like unripe oranges, bravery dances in heavy rain, etc. So if you could just use the last 2 minutes to make a start on that, and you can maybe come back to it later. I'll start the timer and put this in the chat. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the second part of this evening. And we'll start with me reading another poem. Let's see. Let me find it. So the next poem I'm going to read is called Praying to Alcor after my first cervical screening. And all you need to know is that Alcor is a mountain fairy goddess in Vietnamese mythology and is considered to be a matriarchal ancestor to Vietnamese people. Praying to Alcor after my first cervical screening. Alcor, today I pushed my fists under my hips and said your name. My mother says you were a mother before anyone else, and so all our women can find you at the salted edges of their flesh. Long ago, before I ever called on you, a warm pain unraveled, and I stopped singing mid-hymn, convinced someone would know. Another time I left a stain in a friend's bed, along with something solid like a boiled leaf. Alcor, even now I only know you by the wringing of your hands. Sometimes you are the woman in my dreams who bails out an ocean using her daughter's hair, births mountains when she feels the stars shift. More often you are the faint bird my mother draws in the margins of letters. Alcor, I should tell you we still have our own ways of holding on to our bodies, like the tea my mother swears will nourish the womb and lead to healthy pregnancy. When asked, does this hurt, we still lie, brace our knees, stare into brittle white light. Okay, I'm now very happy to hand over to Niroshini, and she will read you another of her amazing poems.
Thank you, Nat, for that and for that beautiful reading. So yes, I'm going to be reading a epistolary poem as well. It's Letters to Sunny Leone. I have to admit, I'm a bit nervous about reading this poem. The first time I ever read it out aloud, even to myself, was not that long ago. Not sure why I'm laughing. There is a reference, just as a content warning, there is reference to assault and mental illness in this poem, so just take care. Okay, so Letters to Sunny Leone. Dear Sunny, I want to explain to you how I lost track of my body, or rather how I lost the sense that I had a body at all, a self that was located in a flesh which I could claim as my own. It happened one February morning when I was a girl. All my memories of my early years of encountering my own anatomy, little brown knees which grazed the underside of school desks, hands that held chubby peaches in the summer, and toes which flicked the bottom of rock pools, rang false to me, to have been some trick of the light. And because I was still a child when it first happened, it was an experience I was not able to comprehend. Naturally, I therefore assumed it was some failing on my part to have lost track of that one thing that kept me tethered to this world, to everything which I had held dear. Where did you pick up your body when you misplaced it, Sunny? To whom did you turn? I think now of my loss and its longings, and how my pelvis is a phantom that talks to me in my dreams. It chatters away, grinding, grinding. 2. Dear Sunny, there is something about the family home and the bedroom which I am trying to put into words. How I have no single memory of it, yet it occupies the entire geography of my childhood. Stuffed animals line the walls of my bedroom in Blacktown, an area in the far eastern suburbs to where my family migrated when I was 5 during the war. Winnie the Pooh and Speedy Gonzales soft toys watched me with great interest every night. We had no money, and my mother brought them from a charity store, submerging them into boiling water in a large cooking pan to rid them of germs. I remember too a polka dot duvet and blanket, yet it is impossible to describe it as a sight of innocence. There are things which the conscious part of my brain refuses to acknowledge, but my body cannot. There are signs of things that came to me too soon without my agreement. Psychologists are prone to say things like, feelings are not facts. I want to understand though, Sunny. What is a non-feeling about a non-fact? 3. Dear Sunny, why is it that all girls want to hunt, want to wrap their limbs around other girls, extend their tentacles from their raw center? Childhood seems to me to have been full of erotic experiences, discovering a dildo in my aunt's house, the curiosity of a Playboy magazine, or coming across hard porn on an open browser. In the girls' bathroom of my primary school, a pack of senior girls approached me lustfully. Later, they would write a letter of apology, forced by the school. So sorry. I showed it to my mother, who ripped it up and never mentioned it again. Even in this, I felt there was some culpability on my part. I wish I had kept that letter, as it may be the only time any of us will ever receive an apology for what is done to us. Sunny, the word for erotic sentiment in my homeland is Shringara. That is a joke. I have no homeland. But what is the word for erotic feeling in childhood? I want to pin it down so that I can turn to it when someone looks at me and says that I am not behaving like a good girl, so I can say that there are no good girls.
Niroshini, that was so beautiful. And I've never heard you read it before, so it was also amazing to hear it in your voice. Thank you so much. And I think one of the most powerful things about that poem is just kind of how this voice unfurls throughout, and how it changes according to who is being addressed. So I guess like the first thing that I wanted to ask was, what is your philosophy for creating and adopting a voice, and how do you do this?
Thanks, Nat. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think writing voices for me is one of the hardest things to do, but also like one of the greatest challenges. I think creating voice can be extremely natural, like something you just like pick up on the wind, and you just build and build. You hear it, and then you maintain that throughout the poem. That's one way. If it's a persona that's not yourself, that does take work. For me, it involves a lot of like historical research, depending like what voice I'm writing as. Sort of imagining sort of the era in which this person is writing, what type of decisions they make. It's almost like you're becoming a heightened version of that person, and you're trying to like embody them and magnify them in the work, essentially. But yes, I think letter poems really lend that type of engagement, because you're like making a direct address, and generally there's like a relationship, isn't there?
Yeah.
So what about you in terms of your wonderful poem? How do you approach voice in that? How do you decide who you want to write a letter poem to?
Yeah. So for me, I think about the things that surround the voice. So that's obviously particular settings and people and circumstances. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a persona poem sequence about Chu Thi Trinh that I didn't read today, but she was a 3rd century Vietnamese warrior woman. And I adopted her voice to do that. And how I did that was I thought not only about her identity as a warrior, but also the other facets that aren't talked about as much. So her identity as an orphan, as a young woman, and as a protector of other women. But in terms of like how I decide who I want to address, so I think it's always the person who best allows you to say what you mean. So for the poem that I read today, I chose Alcor because she's a matriarchal goddess, and addressing her and thinking about her story just put me in the right frame of mind to talk about what I wanted to talk about, especially as I thought kind of reclaiming these taboo spaces is a matriarchal and feminist act.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, how do you decide who you like to address?
I think it's very much about what you're trying to write about. For me, like I've not written like tons of epistolary poems, but what you're trying to write about, and then almost finding a character or an individual that with whom you can have a little bit of almost like a tension in that dialogue. So you're creating almost like a friction in the act of writing the letter, because I think that's what gives the work a bit of energy and intensity.
Yeah.
So yeah, for this particular poem, I was writing a lot. Like the way this poem came about is really like strange, because I'd written like pages and pages and pages of all these scenes, and then essentially it all collapsed into a very small space, and it was all about shame, essentially. And then Sunny Leone is this like a real person, who in the best possible way, and I mean this in the nicest way, has no shame, which I find was very positive, you know, even though society was trying to shame her. So I felt, and it's just one of those things that you don't even know why you make these decisions. I just tried it, and it really, I felt it gave it a little tension. So I think that's just an example of one way you could approach it.
I agree. So have you written persona poems before? Is that right?
Yeah. I've written quite a few persona poems, perhaps not in a in a letter form.
Yeah.
So yeah. And and I know you've written quite a lot of like sort of historical figures. Have you considered, or are you interested in writing more sort of contemporary figures? Or do you think there's like anything that would be added by approaching a contemporary figure?
It's kind of interesting for me because when I write family stories, those poems themselves are informed by present voices, but present voices that are talking about the past. So it would be a question about whether those voices are historical voices or if they're just present voices that are reflecting. But yeah, I have kind of played with writing about certain singers, especially in the context of what they sing about. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting way of approaching it, especially with Vietnam's very rich history of music, both traditional, contemporary, Gai Leung opera, all that kind of thing, and how it's been brought into the present. So I think that would be a new avenue for me if I wanted to write more contemporary things.
And will this be in your collection?
Who knows? Maybe one day. But yeah, when I do write persona poems, I think like it gives you an extra layer of artifice or protection that can make you feel more able to say what you want to say, especially if the subject matter is vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
and you can rely on external factors as well, not necessarily from your own experience.
Yeah, and some of the images just seem to address what you want to say more accurately than any images that you can readily access.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. But I think one of the things is, how do you decide what you want to include and what you want to leave out?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think it's about emotional truth, but also what you feel comfortable putting down on the page. I think like Letters to Sunny Noon is quite interesting for myself, I guess, because it doesn't say that much actually, but it sort of builds an image. So I think like building up sort of impressionistic images tends to be the way I approach writing. Definitely in that poem, and actually there are bits of it that are actually quite explicit, just says things in a very unpoetic way. So yeah, this poem, I think I just put everything into it and trusted that it worked. What about you?
I really like I really vibe with what you said about discomfort. So if I feel uncomfortable about something and can't imagine reading it out loud, I probably wouldn't include it. And I also don't like super identifying information. I think there's ethics you have to think about when writing about history, especially. But I think that's why poetry suits me so well, because it allows us to be circumspect. It allows us to write in fragments, and we can have as many missing bits and redactions and reinterpretations as we want, because what is unsaid or erased or revised just becomes part of the architecture of a piece. And it builds this kind of poetics of fragmentation, I think, because I think readers don't always know exactly what I'm referring to, and I guess you might feel the same way. But I always hope that the underlying emotion is clear, and for me with your work, the underlying emotion is always clear, and I don't need to know exactly what it is you're referring to. Do you feel like that?
I did want to ask you about something. So when you say like identifying factors, like what do you think are the ethics around that? Because I do include identifying factors. Do you think is like an artistic decision that you've made, or do you think there's like a broader ethical question? Or because for me, it's a very pertinent question to me as well. But I also feel at a point it's my story. And I think the more you speak, there's a tension between like shame and speaking. And I feel most of the time, as long as you're not saying something egregiously harmful, there's merit in speaking. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. Leah, thinking about harm is an important one. For me, it's more like technical things. So exact names.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Or like maybe exact dates.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything that the Home Office would like to get hold of, things like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I mean.
Okay, gotcha. Good stuff. Just in the interest of time, shall we move on to the workshop section?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. So I'm going to be taking this workshop. I'm going to get straight into it because I know we don't have that much time. So it's going to be about, surprise, surprise, letter poems. The beautiful thing about letter poems is that they have a wonderful intimacy about them, as Nat and I have just discussed, because you're essentially writing to one person, and to the reader, it's really like overhearing a secret. So the first part of this exercise is brainstorming whom you would like to write the letter to. And the second is about thinking of striking memories that you would like to share or describe to that person. And finally, it's about, the last bit of this is about making associations with that memory that would be not only relevant to that person, but finding sort of striking differences in association. So for example, Sunny Leone, a public figure, an actor, writing about my own memories or whatever. So that's a rough structure. So for the first 3 minutes, we'd like you to make a list of whom you would like to write your letter to. And because we are looking at experiences from childhood, I would encourage you to include in your list perhaps teachers, even toys that you played with, a friend, a real or imaginary, a family member, a neighbor, just anything, anyone or anything in your imagination, but to whom you could address a letter to. So I'll give you 3 minutes for that. Okay, so in the next section, I'd like you to think of the most memorable or surprising or unusual thing that you would like to write about from your childhood. And in this section, it'd be useful to be thinking about when you're writing a letter poem, what are the qualities of it that distinguish it from a normal letter? And to me, this is really about the intensity of language. My friend and fellow Bad Betty Press poet Tana shared a quote with me where she said, "Poetry is language and put under pressure." So I think this is really what makes a letter poem just different from a letter. So have a think about this. Will you have line breaks in your sentences? Will you not have line breaks? So in this section, you're essentially just writing a few sentences about a memorable or surprising thing from your childhood. I'll give you 3 minutes for that as well. Okay, and for the last section, we'll obviously not have enough time, so I'll leave it to you to finish at home. But this is essentially, now you have one list, which is full of people you'd like to write letters to. And on the other hand, you have a list of memories from childhood, which are particularly striking to you. So you literally have an endless possibilities of whom you'd like to write to about what topic. But I suggest that sometimes the most striking differences in association leads you to the most where you can subvert your usual patterns. So pick something from an addressee in the first list and a memory from the second list, and essentially you write to that person or thing about your memory. And that's basically the essence of this workshop. So I will give you 3 minutes, but that will obviously not be enough time. Yeah, if you'd like to do that. And I'd love to hear as well whom you wrote your letters to and what your memory was, if you're comfortable sharing. Okay, so I'll have to stop you there, but yeah, I hope that gives you a sense of how I approach writing letter poems, and hope that was interesting and helpful for you. So I guess all that is left for us to do is to say thank you and conclude with our final poems for this evening. So yeah, so thank you very much to Alice and to the whole Covent Garden stanza. I will start with my poem and we'll then let Nat finish up and say her thank yous. So my final poem is a poem called Raga in Blue. And just what the word raga essentially is a musical mode in Indian classical music. So essentially, this poem is a riff on the color blue, and it's inspired by a painting by Amrita Shergill. So Raga in Blue, After the Little Girl in Blue by Amrita Shergill, 1934. In my dream, all I could see was blue, blue like Peter Rabbit coat blue, blue like the ink of my least favorite pen picked up last winter in the doctor's room, blue like bellflowers and sea holly on an afternoon, blue like bruised berries, a blue dress missing its third button, blue like the shirt Jack wore on his wedding day as he looked in my direction before he turned to face the bride, blue like indigo, Neelam, and baby, blue like the eyeshadow of the soprano in Madame Butterfly on my 17th birthday, blue like the veins of the frog whose heart I had dissected in biology, blue like a morning in Bombay listening to Raga Bhairavi, blue like the sea by my grandmother's home in which I will one day leave a part of myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your beautiful exercise, Niroshini. Yeah, it was really generative and thoughtful, and I'll definitely be returning to it. And thank you for Alice and Niroshini for this space. It's been a really beautiful evening. Yeah, so I'm just going to read one final poem too. This one makes reference, it tells the story of Ho Shung Hung, who was a Vietnamese poet in the 18th century. And it's very kind of loose and fragmented and provisional, because that is the nature of what's known about her life. And I've chosen to write about her and read about her tonight because she does address a lot of taboo subjects and what was considered scandalous at the time in a very powerful way. And also she's someone that I have worked on translations with my mum. I've worked on translating her with my mum. So yeah, she's very important to us both. And her given name loosely translates as spring fragrance. So yeah, I'll start that now. Spring fragrance for Ho Shung Hung. She was born in the late 18th century in a house with 3 altars on a windy night while warlords seized her village. She was the daughter of a respected scholar, an impoverished tutor, a vole, a second wife with willow arms, eyes like betel nuts when dried and split. She was named for her village, for the apricot blossoms, for the sweet waters of the lake, for her petal earlobes, for her mother's scent. Every morning she wound up her mother's hair, cut jackfruit for them both, listened for the shi-shum of women bailing water into rice fields, watched reflections of their bodies in the river. She composed her poems in nom script on the insides of her arms, in dust gathered on tables, while eating dried plums. She wrote about unnamed women weaving at night, men with scrolls, silk robes, puffed chests, fruit falling in downpours, the dark red ache of orgasms. On auspicious days, she kneaded dough until tender, ground beans the colour of her lips, made every fire unholy with the letters of old lovers. According to popular legend, she once fell at the market. On her knees she recited, I stretch my arms to learn the height of the sky. I spread my legs to measure the earth. She had one son who was birthed in secret, did not survive. She called her little plum. She died in the early 19th century, within a few years of her mother, while facing the West Lake, with one arm extended through the window, heat still uncurling in her chest. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for just a totally incredible evening. I found it so sort of powerful, so moving. I knew these poems on the page, but to hear them in your own voices was something absolutely different. And I know for me, those exercises you set were really radical, really generative, and they're part of your sort of generosity as poets who work within a community, both of fellow writers, but also of readers, sort of reaching out into the world. I think we're all going to look back on this evening and think we saw 2 really great, really important poets continuing their journey out to meet their readers. And, you know, from all of us, I really say thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice.
Thank you so much, Alice.
Thank you for your generosity, and and thank you so much to Nat as well for sharing this evening.
Yeah, well, and anyway, yes, thank you again from all of us.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you for having us.